right, I'm now joined by Daniel Bessner, um, historian, international relations guru, Jacobin man about town. I was talking to Adam at the end there a little bit about U.S. imperialism, and that ended up being a much better transition than I was thinking that we'd have to talk about an article that you wrote for Jacobin about these war games that happened in 2002. So before we get into the meat of it, like set us up a little bit, right? What was the point supposed to be?
Sure. Well, before we even get into that, I just want to point out the fact that there's a Band-Aid on my head, right? People will be watching this, right, Ben, on video? Yeah.
Yeah.
So in the latest adventures of Vera the dog, who people might remember from my last appearance, caused me to go to the vet. Vera got into, she's a genius. She figured out how to basically create a step stool to get on a table where there was a bunch of Jolly Rancher candy. So Courtney, my partner, and I went out, and she had basically a bag, not that much, but a ton of Jolly Rancher candy, and was fucking frantic for like 45 minutes to an hour and a half, some long amount of time. And in her running around the house, smashed into my head, and now I have a Band-Aid. So that is what's going. Totally smashed. She was just super pumped up running, but so I just wanted to apologize for that. But
Yeah, I was wondering about that because I remembered you having a Band-Aid on your head.
Also caused.
Okay. I was like, wow, this is a really slow healing cut. All right.
Yeah, it's a different cut actually on the opposite side. She was a Tijuana street dog. And so she's still getting off the mean streets and accommodating herself to civilized life. But just wanted to explain that.
Fair
But let
enough.
me get into the war games. So a couple of things. One, I think like the military is just generally an important site of leftist sort of thinking and analysis. I think that like very clearly in most countries throughout most periods of modern history, the military has been a site of reaction, but not always. Most famously, probably the Kiel Rebellion in northern Germany that actually anticipated the end of World War I and helped inspire a series of sort of socialist republics throughout Germany that lasted for a little bit, and of course, you know, the Bolshevik, the Red Army, and things along those lines. Now, I'm not saying like the Red Army itself is a progressive force. There's a long history there, but just saying that like militant action, military action is crucial to any left project. Then even think if you're thinking about today with Trump, right? Like I think we're lucky that the American military is like basically this sort of faceless bureaucracy without charismatic generals. But you know, it wouldn't have been impossible to think that there's some sort of charismatic reactionary general who could have actually put some weight behind Trump's call for a coup. And I think the absence of that is one of the many reasons that there's not going to be that Biden will become president. But it's just, you know, an important side of action. So I just think that like as a space, the military is an important thing for the left to think about. Do you want me to continue, Ben, or do you want to say anything? I was talking for a while.
No. That's good. So, yeah, I guess I do want to just plug here that at some undetermined point in the next week, Daniel is going to come on the YouTube stream if you're listening to this as a podcast to talk about the issue that he was just alluding to with Trump and why, you know, I think both of us are not really on the Trump is on the verge of staging a military coup and imposing fascism train, and maybe also more broadly though, you know, what we can learn from thinking about those issues and about some of the debate that's happened about them in the last few years. But yeah, so this is an important, you know, like this is an important subject for leftists to pay attention to, maybe more attention than we typically do, because I think oftentimes on the left, we only notice that the military exists when it starts bombing a new place, where, you know, but there are interesting things that are going on in other contexts, which maybe brings us to the subject of the piece.
Right, right. And it's also something to think about just in case like a future Bernie or let's say President AOC or someone actually does win the presidency. One of the major constituencies in American politics is the military. You know, the Joint
Right.
Chiefs of Staff have an enormous influence on American foreign policy and also American domestic policy through things like the VA and, you know, military contracts and things along those lines. So it's just something to be aware of. But what I explored in the piece is this event that happened in 2002, really between 2000 and 2002, called the Millennium Challenge, which was a congressionally mandated war game. So just to give a bit of the history of it, the United States wins the Cold War, right? So this is a big event. But I think even more importantly for understanding the direction of military affairs is that soon after the Cold War ends, let's say 1989, 1990, in the turn of 1990 into 1991, the United States what I was going to say occupies, that's not the right word, fights the first Gulf War, Gulf
Right.
War One, whatever you
Mhm.
want to call it, first Iraq War. And this is actually really important because the United States absolutely destroys Saddam's military in a series of about 4 days. There's about a month of bombardments, if I recall correctly, 30-ish days, followed by basically a 4-day routing of Saddam's army that had invaded Kuwait. Saddam's military, not just his army. And so this was a big deal because Saddam actually had a pretty substantial military. I think at the time, I think it was one of the fourth, like the fourth most powerful in the world, measured by some metrics. That might be wrong. I apologize. I have the data somewhere, but it was it was a legit military. It wasn't like a fake force, and the U.S. fucking destroyed it. And this basically led to people arguing that there was something called the Revolution in Military Affairs, the RMA, and that this revolution in military affairs was basically defined by the use of advanced technologies, both advanced weapons systems, but also things like GPS, surveillance technologies, and radar. And that what advocates of the RMA, the Revolution in Military Affairs, were arguing was that this provided the material basis for the long-standing American dream, which was to make war clean. And as I talk about in the piece, going back to the 20s and the 30s and the advent of planes, you know, metal planes with powerful engines, there was the idea that one would be able to basically end ground wars of the type seen in World War I, these sort of trench wars, trench warfare, by having planes fly over the trenches, bombing, let's say, an enemy's electrical communication system, their networks of transportation, their logistics networks, whatever, and ending wars quickly. This was the dream of basically people who were in the Army Air Forces, which, as the name implies, was part of the Army, and people who were advocating for Air Force independence, which eventually happens in 1947, were saying that the Air Force had its own strategic logic. That is, it goes above ground troops to destroy an enemy's industrial base, network, communication base, as opposed to just aiding ground troops as they go forward. Of course, in World War II, this doesn't quite work out the same way. The Air Force, the American Air Force, still part of the Army, is not able with the Royal Air Force to basically defeat Hitler with just planes. You have D-Day, you have ground invasion, but in the Japanese theater, things look a little bit differently. Things look a little bit different because you do have the so-called island hopping campaigns, but also the war ends with an atomic bomb, right? And this, Air Force advocates argued, was the demonstrating that the Air Force was able to end wars in an instant. And so there's this sick letter sent from Lawrence Norstad, a very high-ranking Air Force official, that says, like, see, strategic bombing is real. We ended the Japanese imperial domination with 2 bombs. It might have killed tens of thousands of people and hundreds of thousands over time, but we ended the war quickly. And so this becomes like still a rationale in American political culture, this in military culture, the search for clean war. And this is what the revolution in military affairs seemed to augur, that you'd be able to have quick, cheap, efficient wars. So Ben, do you want me to clarify anything, and then I could go a little bit more into what happens after that, or?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think probably that's pretty clear about what the, like what the belief was, right, about what the Gulf War had shown, right? So then what happens with these war games, and how does that relate to that?
Sure. So there's a bunch of people in the military who are arguing in favor of this revolution in military affairs, this RMA. But there's, of course, other people within the military who say this is bullshit. Like, I've been hearing these things since, oftentimes they were Vietnam veterans, and they were like, I've been hearing these things since Vietnam, that technology and quantification and models are going to end wars quickly and cheaply. And in fact, in Vietnam, sometimes the models would show that the Americans were winning when in fact they very much were not. So there's basically, after the Gulf War, a divide between those who support the RMA and those who basically argue that it's bullshit. Now, one of the main people who argued that it was bullshit was this guy named Lieutenant, who was a Marine Corps Lieutenant General named Paul K. Van Riper. His nickname was Rip Van Riper, both a play on Rip Van Winkle and also a play on his last name being Riper. And he was like, no, the RMA is bullshit. So Van Riper
sounds a little bit like the General Jack D. Ripper.
Yeah, very much like General from Dr. Strangelove. Which is a funny little illusion. But so Van Riper retires from the Marines in 1997, but it's actually not that bad a time in American history to be a retired general, because throughout the 1990s, particularly in the second Clinton administration, there's this push to transform the military. It's called defense transformation. And what is meant by that is that basically your people within the military are trying to incorporate the technologies and the lessons of the revolution in military affairs into doctrine, into the procurement of weapons systems, et cetera, et cetera. And so one of the ways that, the military decided to demonstrate first that transformation was something good, and second to determine what to purchase, was through war games. So there's this huge surge of war games in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And the people who are hired to play in war games are oftentimes retired generals, because an actual general is busy, he's moving around, he has other duties, blah, blah, blah. So what happens is the defense contractors who run these games, in tandem with the Department of Defense, hire retired generals like Van Riper. And in fact, in I think it's 2000, might be 99, I forget, but 99 or 2000, it's in the article. The American Congress actually passes a law that says in order to prove if transformation works, if it's a thing that we should do, basically, there needs to be this like huge war game, termed the Millennium Challenge. That's not in the congressional authorization, but it eventually becomes known as the Millennium Challenge. And beginning in 2000 and in 2002 is when the Millennium Challenge takes place. And it's a very complex thing that happens between 2000 and 2002, but basically there's a series of different events. They're called spirals that simulate a political standoff that eventually emerges in a war game, the deployment of American troops to a country that's meant to simulate the Gulf War, a country meant to simulate either Iran or Iraq, right, probably a combination of the two. That is called, which is what people mean by the Millennium Challenge 2002. So just to, and then I'll stop, just to be clear, the whole process between 2000 and 2002 is called the Millennium Challenge, right, and the game is called the Millennium Challenge 2002. And so it's a little complex. And what this article does is that it explicates this game and the controversy around it.
Yeah, I should say, by the way, I never said the name of the article. It's the general who brought down the American Empire. So all right. So there's this country that's supposed to be Iran, Iraq, a little bit of each, and that's facing, the war game is a simulation of is acting out, that country facing off against the United States. And if you believe in this revolution in military affairs, then we presumably should be able to. I keep on trying to come up with a clever way to combine Iran and Iraq, but there's no way to do that because they're the same, the same first three letters, and I don't know what to do with that. But Iraqan, right? They had that we should be that presumably, if you believe in the RMA, then we should be able to just flatten Iraqum and succeed, and everything should be good.
Yeah, very quickly. So basically these spirals are like kind of pre-war games, and what eventually leads to this scenario, which is that there's an earthquake in Iraqin, the unnamed Middle Eastern country, and that this earthquake destabilizes the society, which leads a general to separate from basically the religious national leadership and begin to assert control over the territory. This general, who is in the Millennium Challenge 2002, is Van Riper. Van Riper is hired to play this general who has separated from basically the Ayatollah. Let's just say the Ayatollah, and is like seizing territory throughout the Gulf, in particular the Persian Gulf. And so the explicit scenario is that Van Riper, the general, the Iranian general played by Van Riper, has seized a series of islands in the Gulf and has begun to charge shipping companies essentially tolls to ensure safe passage through the Gulf. And this is, of course, a big deal because a ton of raw materials, most importantly oil, is transported through the Gulf every day. And so in response to this, the US government, the so-called Blue Team, basically dispatches an aircraft carrier battle group in order to challenge Van Riper. And this is where the game begins. The game begins at this moment. Van Riper has started charging tolls, and the US military, the US Navy in particular, has been deployed to the Persian Gulf. So should I say what happens?
Yep, please.
So basically the Navy arrives, and the head of the Navy is a guy named Lieutenant General, I believe he's a Lieutenant General, apologies if I'm wrong, B.B. Bell, B-E-L-L, issues Van Riper an ultimatum. He says, you have 24 hours to surrender, otherwise we're going to take you and your forces out. So what Van Riper does, remember, Van Riper is trying to disprove the revolution in military affairs, is that he begins to use low-tech technology. So when the US Navy went into the Persian Gulf, they destroyed, in the simulation, they destroyed basically the sort of secret ways that Van Riper was communicating with his forces. I believe they were supposed to be underground. A lot of this is vague, but I believe they were supposed to be underground, basically, networks. So the Navy destroys these underground communications relays. And then they think that Van Riper is going to have to communicate with cell phones, which are easily monitored by the then current technology of the Navy in early 2000s. But what Van Riper does, he's like, no, I know these guys are going to monitor me, so I'm going to communicate in with basically low-tech ways. So what Van Riper does is that he's given this ultimatum, and he's like, I know the U.S. has adopted a doctrine of preemption, right? George W. Bush says this. The U.S. is going to adopt a doctrine to prevent wars, to preempt wars, and Van Riper says, if they're going to preempt me, I'm going to preempt them. And so he uses motorcycle couriers, right? He doesn't have to communicate on cell phones. He sends motorcycle couriers. When he's trying to tell his planes to take off, he uses light signals, which were used during World War II. And most famously, to initiate his preemptive attack, Van Riper used coded messages in the call to prayer that come from the minarets of this, fake Middle Eastern Muslim country. So Van Riper does this. He secretly initiates an attack. He totally takes the U.S. Navy by surprise. And I believe he winds up in the end sinking 16 of the naval vessels that had been, of the American naval vessels in the simulation that had been dispatched to the Persian Gulf, including one aircraft carrier. And for comparison, I believe during the Pearl Harbor attack, the most disastrous naval event in American history, I believe in the end, it sort of like depends how you count sunken ships, but I believe 4 ships were sunk. So imagine like quadruple that amount. And if this attack were real, 20,000 US soldiers would die. So basically, this low-tech Van Riper attack, which is done by missiles, which is done by planes, which is also done by kamikaze assaults from small vessels, succeeds in the simulation of sinking 16 US naval ships, including an aircraft carrier. So this would basically be like by far the largest naval disaster in American history. And so it totally destroyed what the Navy intended to happen, which is what we think. We haven't gotten the documents, but like clearly they didn't want to lose. They wanted to prove that the RMA was real and that they would be able to take out unnamed Middle Eastern country, Iraq or Iran, in 2002. And even though they were supposed to be like 2007 capabilities, but you could read about that in the thing, but basically that they would be able to take out a Middle Eastern country. And so after Van Riper succeeds in sinking the ships, there's basically a day and a half of stunned silence at the simulation center in Virginia, and the blue team, the American team, decides to refloat the ships, which is actually what would happen in a war game. The problem, though, is that Van Riper, and you could read about more details in the article, had been promised that this game wouldn't be fucked with, that it wouldn't be fixed. Because he had a previous experience where he basically thought a war game was fixed, and he was like, this is fucked up. And they're like, don't worry, the Millennium Challenge 2002 won't be fixed. But anyway, they refloat the ships, and then I won't get into the details because that's the big event. But throughout the next 4, 5, 6 days, as Van Riper continues to play the game, the blue team essentially cooks the books in favor of its winning. And Van Riper eventually resigns, and he leaks this information. Eventually, the details are in the article, and this becomes this whole hullabaloo over whether the U.S. Navy fixed this war game, which I should recall cost, all told, in the 2000, 2001, 2002, cost about $250 million. $250 million, involved 13,500 troops, involved a bunch of I think it's 9 live fire scenarios, even though, so most of the game is simulated in computer systems, and there's like a series of, like you have a computer model that models attacking civil infrastructure. You have a computer model that models artillery fire. So all these models were put together into one gigantic simulation. So most of the game takes place in a simulation, but there will also be like a live exercise, like a Marine will attack a base, and if they capture the base, it'll count as like 15 captured bases in the game. I get into the details in the article. That's not important, but whatever. It was a very important, very expensive, very large game that Van Riper publicly accused of being fixed. And this, has this whole drama around it.
Yeah. So, I mean, I guess just to pull out a little bit here, right? So this is this massive embarrassment. They put all this money into it. This is supposed to be the proof of concept for the RMA, and instead it started out being a disaster, and then they kind of decided to, I mean, I guess the equivalent in a real war would be like an act of God to intervene to reverse the losses. So what, if anything, did anybody in the military establishment actually learn from this?
So this is like, it gets into the details. So the question is, was the Millennium Challenge a war game or an experiment? Right. If it's a war game, it should be free play, and they shouldn't be able to do things like refloat ships, right? If it's an experiment, then they could be able to refloat ships because of basically because it allows the experiment to continue. And I think that they were never clear on what this game was supposed to be. I think they wanted it to be a game that proved them right, but that isn't what it turned out to be. So the truth is, like, we don't really know because we don't have access to the discussions and the documents. They might not even exist. But that's my sense, is that they wanted it to be like kind of free play, enough free play to prove that this is what the U.S. military should do. But anyway, so the RMA basically goes relatively unchallenged for several years until the actually James Mad Dog Mattis, who you might remember as Trump's Secretary of Defense, becomes like head of the Marine Corps experimental unit, and he agrees with Van Riper and is like, the RMA is bullshit, and he essentially purges it from the doctrine of what the Joint Forces Command, which also no longer exists. But I think it's important because this is a story that really reflects this long-standing dream in American life, and really in the American political imagination, for clean war, for war that could be made clean. And I think this has become this sort of liberal idea. I think you see it under Obama, the late Obama administration, with the turn towards drone warfare, and I bet you're going to see it in the coming Biden administration. This idea that with enough know-how, enough American ingenuity, enough science and technology, you're going to be able to make war clean. And I think Van Riper, who probably doesn't politically align with socialists, is nonetheless right in that war is really chaotic. It is something that is so fundamentally unmanageable that, as Karl von Clausewitz, the Prussian general, said in the 1810s and 1820s, it's in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars, is that you really can't clear the fog of war. That the dream of clean war is basically bullshit. And that, this liberal fantasy that you're going to be able to make war humane is absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, and which is a particularly disturbing thing to think about, because as Biden comes in, and look, at the best of times, empire is bipartisan, and as I've heard you point out before, there are some, disturbing signs that the Biden administration might be more like the first term Obama administration, the second term Obama administration, in terms of its willingness to, to do things for example, like the regime change in Libya that happened under Obama. At the same time, though, the other, side of that empire is bipartisan coin is that there is a lot of ridiculous, bizarre mythology, which is even believed on parts of the left, that the Trump administration was somehow like isolationist or quasi-dovish, and beyond just the most obvious stuff, like, they doubled the rate of drone strikes in Yemen. They tore up the Iran deal. And in fact, they seem to be worried about the possibility that Biden might reverse on that and try to get the Iran deal back, as much as that might actually be difficult at this point, because we've already shown that we can't be trusted, when we negotiate these things. That if there's the next president comes in, can just scrap it like it's nothing. But that they're worried about this, and in fact, I've seen reports that that one of the parting gifts of the Trump administration has been imposing a whole shitload of new sanctions on Iran to try to make it more difficult to restore any sort of diplomatic relations between the U.S. and Iran. And it really seems like the fact that there weren't any, like people say, oh, Trump didn't start any new wars. Like, yeah, okay. He appointed a bunch of horrific, like neocons, to important positions, and they did their best to stir the pot, and nothing that came out of the pot actually developed into a new war. But that's not the sort of thing you should give out Nobel Peace Prizes for.
Yeah, I mean, the important thing in my view is like also to even begin transforming the structure, and just Trump did absolutely none of that. I mean, Trump was like a dangerous and reckless foreign policy president who did absolutely nothing to transform the structure of U.S. foreign policy in a meaningful way.
Yeah.
So yeah.
So what?
Let's not celebrate this.
Yeah. I mean, like, really, this is probably the area where there's the least to celebrate in any possible outcome of an American, election. That's, I mean, there would have been, if we'd gotten Bernie, but yeah. So, I mean, given that I guess I'm just trying to think how to put this, right? So, given that what should be learned from this, from this debacle, I mean, beyond just the fact that it's like, it's a good story. It's like sort of you mouth is kind of ajar the whole time you read this, but like that the thing that should be learned from this is about the impossibility of.
Right. So this is what it's kind of interesting. I don't know what you think, but I still think like on the left, there's this idea that we could be like the good empire. I don't think they would ever be framed in that terms, but it's just something that struck out to me. Like a few months ago, I think I posted a question on Twitter about like basically humanitarian intervention, like should we do it along those lines? And like a lot of people, and most people who follow me are left, were like, yes. And I think it's important to emphasize, like I think that the lesson is like war cannot be made clean, it cannot be made humane, it cannot be made cheap in terms of either lives or money. And so like it's just not possible to do that. Basically, it's a fundamentally horrible, chaotic, inhumane thing. And
well, because it's tricky, right? Because people will say, I mean, I think that presumably lots of people, who are left enough that they follow Daniel Bessner on Twitter, are would say, like, if confronted with the question at this point, look, should the United States have hundreds of military bases scattered all around the world? Should we be intervening in other countries all the time? They'd say, no, of course not, right? But then if you flatly say, okay, so not ever, then it's a lot harder for a lot of people to sign on to this, because this is so ingrained in our political culture that, I mean, one of the I mean, certainly one of the strangest experiences along these lines in my life was when I was teaching in South Korea, and there had just been actually a U.S. South Korean military exercise that had involved firing on this unoccupied, but like that involved going into what the North Koreans regarded as North Korean territory, although nobody was there, and the North Koreans responded by actually like firing live ammunition on a place where a bunch of people actually did live, and a few of them died, and a bunch of them fled to the other side of the country, right? Because most South Koreans live right by the border, and then the response. I mean, one, it was just bizarre, like seeing how blasé most Koreans I knew were about this. Like, oh yeah, that kind of sucks. This happens, right? But then the South Korean response was to like basically fire a few shells back and say, don't do it again. And I told my students the next day, to put this really into perspective, I come from a country where, when I was a little kid, we invaded Grenada because they were building an airport and you never know. Right. Like that's how we're, it's so ingrained in American culture that like, even if you think like, oh yeah, Reagan was going a little nuts with the Grenada thing, that the idea that this is just fundamentally something that we're not in the business of doing is just really really almost outside of the realm of what's thinkable for most people.
And I think that's right. I mean, like, I think it's also related to this Puritanism in American culture. This is like millenarian, the idea that like the goal of the United States is to transform the world. And I think a lot of that is still very much evident in this sort of pro-imperialist is too much, but like pro-doing something is sort of the way that I like the idea that the United States needs to like do something, which I think a lot of people on across the political spectrum believe. And so I think that sort of thing is like really, really difficult to overcome.
Yeah. Like, or even to try to change the conversation to the extent that like, hey, you want to do something? Here's something you could do. You could like, there's some terrible conflict going on somewhere across the world. You want to do something. A thing that we could do would be to take in every single refugee from that conflict who wants to come here. That could count as doing something. But of course, yeah. You say that, most people roll their eyes because that's just not what they mean, and it's not within the boundaries of what we think of as doing something, and maybe and so the the Millennium Challenge, nothing else, a good reminder that what we actually do have in mind, right? When we talk about doing something, the range of things that we have in mind are things that are impossible to do. In ways that don't have tremendous human costs, certainly, and are also impossible to do in ways that have costs that can be predicted and managed, even on the American side, right? I mean, we have an incredibly powerful empire, but that doesn't actually make us omnipotent.
Right. I mean, I think it's interesting. Like, I feel like we shape the world, but we don't control it. And let's stop shaping it.
Yeah. Well, that's a good note to end on. Thank you so much, Daniel. And when I have you back on the YouTube stream this week, we'll get into the fascism stuff.
Cool. All right, Ben. I'll see you at some point this week.
All right. Sounds good. Thank you.
Bye, brother.